Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second annual Corporate Integrity Panel Discussion, a review of the most egregious cases of corporate misbehavior from the previous year. I'm Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics here at the Daniels College of Business. We are delighted that you have joined us this morning, and we look forward to a very robust discussion, both from the panel as well as from your questions. I would like to thank our sponsors for their generous financial support of our work. You have been seeing their names and brand marks on the screen behind me. CoBank was our inaugural charter partner and has been part of our team from the beginning. Jim Shanahan is here representing CoBank. Thank you very much, Jim, and your colleagues. Level 3 was our second charter partner, and we have them to thank for access to their global IP platform by which we are live streaming this event. I know that Neil Eckstein is in the audience somewhere. There you are, Neil. Thank you and your colleagues from Level 3 very much for your help. The Daniels Fund is a strong supporter of the Institute as well as a great partner of the college. IHS Markit is a loyal supporter of our work, and we appreciate their help and participation. Pinnacle Assurance and Deloitte LLC have been generous in their support for the Institute as well. And I know Sandy Roth, a managing partner for Deloitte here in Denver, is in the audience. There you are. Thank you very much to you and your partners. And we would like to thank the many individual members and friends of the Institute who have been very generous and very loyal in their support of the Institute's work. Some of you are here in the audience, and we wish to thank you very much. This morning, we're going to discuss three very significant issues in the world of corporate integrity and responsibility. The Wells Fargo scandal involving ghost customer accounts, incentive compensation, and whistleblowing, the global pharmaceutical prescription drug pricing story, and the tech industry's initiative to build some ethical decision-making protocols into their artificial intelligence programs. And we have an outstanding panel and moderator to lead us through this discussion. Cindy Fukami is Associate Chair and Professor in the Department of Management, Education, and Office of Executive and Professional Education here at Daniels. Cindy is a recognized expert and award-winning teacher in organizational behavior, leadership, and performance and reward systems. Cindy, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Bart Alexander is principal at Alexander & Associates. Previously, Bart served as Chief Responsibility Officer for Molson Coors Brewing Company. Bart has also served in senior leadership roles in economic development and health and human services at the federal, state, and local level. Welcome, Bart. We are delighted to have you with us this morning. Kevin O'Brien is an associate professor in the Business Ethics and Legal Studies Department here at Daniels. Kevin also serves as an independent director on the Centura Health Board of Directors and is a leading expert on Sarbanes-Oxley issues as well as corporate whistleblowing issues and the law. Our moderator is Paul Gibbons, an author, speaker, and consultant practicing predominantly in the field of change management. Paul is the founder and former chairman of Future Consideration, a London-based consultancy serving clients in the global financial services industry.
How many people were here, if I may ask, last year for our program? Many of you, more than half. Last year we covered FIFA, LIBOR, and Volkswagen. Again, Dan and I didn't have any trouble finding three vitally important issues to talk about this year. There were many that we could have chosen to look back upon last year. Volkswagen has, I think, going to pay $2.8 billion in fines to settle criminal charges, $1.4 billion to settle civil suits, and they're under court supervision for 3 years. LIBOR, they indicted about 20 people. I think only one has done hard jail time. But again, the worst of that scandal may be behind us. And in FIFA, I think 8 people were indicted from the FIFA organization. They have a new chief executive, and they have a new code of conduct, if you will.
The interesting question from our point of view is those scandals, all of them, took about 10 years to manifest, but there were certainly indications that they were happening 10 years in advance, slightly more in the case of FIFA, is whether we ought to have been able to detect those before they were brought to a head in 2015. And the second question, in a sense, looking forward, is what have we learned? So are banks more vigilant? Have they learned from some of what's happened at LIBOR? have the auto manufacturers and other manufacturing companies learned from what happened in Volkswagen? Have national organizations such as the International Olympic Committee learned from what's happened at FIFA? I fear not. I think there's a psychological tendency, if you will, to try and isolate such problems, to ring fence them, to say, for example, if you're chief executive of another bank, there before the grace of God go I. Or that could never happen here. And I think the problems that those three organizations faced were more endemic and more systemic, and not really isolated cases. And so it's my speculation or it's my hypothesis that are things like that going on at other companies, other banks, other manufacturing companies, other auto manufacturers, other international organizations right now as we speak. And are there any which are on that 10-year uphill trajectory now, which we're missing, we ought to be paying attention to? So that's part of the provocation I offer today. I don't think we're learning quickly enough, and I don't think we're paying enough attention to what seems to be happening. So 2016 was a very interesting year. We saw and I certainly don't want to make this a political discussion, but we saw a rise of populism, of nativism, and of nationalism. And we saw experts, in a sense, fall into disrepute. Globalism and pluralism fall into disrepute. That's going to continue in 2017. We haven't seen the end of that, perhaps not by a long ways. We have to ask ourselves what happens if the trend continues as it has been going. I think that's an interesting question. And the word of the year for 2016, see if you can guess, was post-truth. Interesting. Other contenders were Brexiteer, adulting, the glass cliff, alt-right, and woke. And I think it says something about the weightiness of 2016. Because the word of the year in 2015 was an emoji, a smiley face with tears of joy, crying. And all the words from 2016 picked by the Oxford English Dictionary as being the words of the year, words most searched, most newest, fastest growth, were pretty politically heavy words. So what's post-truth? It refers to a political culture where debate is framed by appeals to emotion and ideology rather than details of policy or facts. When facts are challenged in a post-truth world, people tend to double down. They tend to challenge the alternative facts, is a word that's been thrust upon us. And people tend to double down around back. And I don't mean this to be political. Pick your least favorite politician, your least favorite political party. I don't mean to single anyone out in this. I think it's, again, a systemic or an endemic problem. In a post-truth world, you don't target a wide audience with your speech. You target a narrow audience, and you target their confirmation biases. You speak not to convince the wide audience, but to inflame the smaller audience. Now, why is this important for business ethics? Why have I included that? I think the problem is bigger and wider than just a political problem. If we thought it was just a political problem, we could say it's just politicians doing more of what they always do. Boring. I don't think we need to pay special attention to it, but I think it's bigger and wider. And I think it's systemic and endemic in a way some of the issues from 2015 were. I think we rely on experts to lead us towards the truth, to provide us with a factual basis for the decisions we make as citizens, as consumers, and as business leaders. And I think without expertise, it's very hard to have a basis, a truthful basis for the decisions we make. But even maybe more importantly, I think truth is the basis for trust. And I really do think, this sounds like a fanciful thing to say, trust makes the world go round. Trust in institutions, trust in each other, micro examples of trust. So one Brexit politician said very frighteningly, the world is tired of experts. I think that's a horrible, slippery slope. And again, the link I wish to make is between expertise, between truth, and between trust. And I don't think we can run businesses, and I don't think we can run societies. I don't think we can operate the way we do. And I don't think it matters in North Korea, this is interesting too. Because I think these problems of trust and truth really only matter in our free societies. I don't think it matters very much if they trust their institutions in North Korea or not. So I'd like to consider the discussions that the panelists will look at today through that lens, if you will, through the lens of truth. So without saying too much about what the panel of experts are going to talk about, Wells Fargo Wells Fargo, excuse me, Wells Pharma. Well, they
pretty good.
are. And on the face of it, all of these are different. Wells Fargo seems to be behind us, and it seems to be contained. 2 million consumers were deceived, it seems. The problem seems to be incentives, whistleblowing, and accountability. I think the problems in pharma are not contained. I don't think they're behind us, and I think they're much more systemic. So I think the problem is much bigger than EpiPens and Daraprim, which were the two drugs that made it into the headlines last year. Here's some interesting things. 72% of Americans think drug costs are unreasonable. We pay between 2 and 10 times what other countries pay for drugs. I think that's an interesting point. Pharmaceutical companies cite research and development costs. Well, here's something that makes that seem like a post-truth statement. They spend twice as much on marketing. Very interesting. So I think we assume in the pharmaceutical industry that there's a close link between their goals, which are profitability, and public good and public wellness. I don't think that's the case. I think there are drugs of the poor countries of the world that aren't targeted for research because they wouldn't be very profitable. I think pharmaceutical companies encourage drug taking, and in the case of antibiotics, it's a very bad idea. Antibiotic resistance may be one of the things we have to deal with in the 21st century. There are now bugs that will resist everything that you throw at it, and why is it? Overuse of antibiotics. And one of the root causes of overuse of antibiotics is marketing and sales of antibiotics and overuse of them. So these are, I think, systemic pharmaceutical industry problems. And the final, I think, thing we should look at is the pharmaceutical industry, to a large extent, is self-regulated. They do a certain amount of public good. But the way they test products and the way they report the test results is very skewed. So one of the little tricks they can do is if a trial's going well, they can stop the trial because they haven't published the protocol in advance. If the trial's going poorly, they can extend it. If they do 10 trials, they'll report the 3 most favorable trials to the FDA, if you will, or regulatory authorities. There's lots of ways they skew results to de-emphasize, if you want, the side effects and overemphasize the benefits. So there are problems with the pharmaceutical industry that extend beyond this year. And then artificial intelligence is unlike either of those, is that may be problems that are in the, I don't know, say very far future I may not live to see, but between 10 and 50 years, experts think we're going to get something called human-level machine intelligence. And what does that look like? Well, up until now, it's been confined to science fiction. But if we can get computers to learn the way babies learn, at the speed at which computers can learn, so they're as clever as we are learning, but as fast as they are, you develop an intelligence, you might develop an intelligence that makes us the second most intelligent species on the planet. Now that's been confined to science fiction, but AI is producing incredible results. How many people have an Amazon Echo or an Alexa personal assistant at home? My children, my 6-year-old child comes home. First thing he says is, "Hello, Alexa, play music." You know, it's a different, I think a different world. Well, that's artificial intelligence. And the funny thing about AI is that wouldn't have been called, that's not really called AI today. That was unthinkable. That sort of level of natural language processing was unthinkable 20 years ago. It was one of the problems that thought it would be too hard. So artificial intelligence is, in that sense, hard AI, human-level machine intelligence is a very scary thing. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, given our experience of banks and given our experience of pharmaceutical companies, is whether self-regulation of artificial intelligence is enough because of the existential risk it may pose, and whether industries which pose existential risks, self-regulation is good enough. And I pose that as a question. I don't really know. But I also know regulation isn't the answer, because you know what? They're very smart in Silicon Valley, and artificial intelligence research is going at a hell of a pace. And our regulators, if regulation is the path we choose to take, we're going to have to keep up with that. And I don't think they can, which raises another host of questions. So these are the sort of conundrums that I'd like to pose you for. More questions perhaps there than answers. I'd like to hand over, I think, Cindy, I think you were, draw the short straw. You're going to go first. It's some preparatory or introductory remarks. Over to you.
Yes, absolutely. And I wanted to tell you that my mic isn't on.
Oh.
I don't think so. Okay, but I think it's for the camera. What would you like me to do? There it is. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. I will be speaking a little bit later about the Wells Fargo situation, which I do not think is over by a long shot. And to me, these three cases together illustrate an interesting change in our society over my own lifetime. I grew up in the Watergate and Vietnam era. And how long did it take us to unpack Watergate? And how did we have to go about doing this, right? So it was a shocking thing, and eventually it came to justice. And then fast forward to Governor Romney speaking at a private occasion. Somebody has their cell phone and records him, and we're all very shocked about that. That was the 40% comment of the governor. And then we fast forward to our most recent election, where we had fairly interesting things on videotape, and nobody seemed to get all disturbed about that. We're getting I think, conditioned to hearing that people aren't who we think they are. And it doesn't seem to give us much of a concern about things, because we can just call it post-truth, or we can call it, I love that other one, the alternative facts, which is kind of like military intelligence, right? It's like an oxymoron. Psychologists could explain easily why we blame others. It's called the fundamental attribution error. We give ourselves all kinds of credit, and we're very happy to blame other people for their problems. And this is something, if anybody wants to, we can talk about later, but it's a pretty typical thing. But who thinks they're going to get away with people not knowing anymore? And how is artificial intelligence going to deal with things like fundamental attribution error and the psychology of things? Will we have better people, or will we have flawed robots? I'm not sure where this is all going to wind up, but this notion of the cover-up, I think, is really making a big shift right now in society.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Take it on here.
Just my perspective to introduce corporate integrity as we're going to apply in these three situations. What I first start off with my students is asking them the question, are you willing to make that ethical decision to comply with the laws and rules and regulations of the country in which you do business? And I really let them think about that. And maybe all through their life, when are they going to have that key moment, that seminal moment where their life can forever change, when they're confronted with an ethical decision that will affect the rest of their life? Perhaps in whistleblowing, maybe at Wells Fargo. At Wells Fargo, I have to admit, that's the only bank I've had since 1973, becoming a student here. And I just thought it's been a great bank. But right now I'm questioning, have they reached a point possibly where they've made an ethical decision not to comply? And what does that mean? Does that mean it's a corrupt organization similar to RICO? Do you give up your license to do business when we get more and more information, and we're going to really digest this? I'm blogging on Wells Fargo. If you put Kevin O'Brien and Wells Fargo, you'll bring up my blog posts. But there's over 16, 17. I added the new one that just came out about the issue of
internal auditors.
Yes, internal auditors and the employees being forewarned. And so it's just one thing after another. I'm on the board of directors, the Independent and Audit Compliance Committee at Centura Health, and I really appreciate the approach that they're taking to corporate integrity. They're focusing on all their corporate governance procedures based on the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations in 2004, and really focusing on those regulations about what does it mean to have an effective ethics and compliance program, and how do you establish that tone at the top. And they're focused, Centura Health is the largest employer in the state, not for profit, but very, very focused on making sure that they are in compliance. They've made that ethical decision. One final point that I'm interested between the ongoing battles between the two parties, what's going to happen with whistleblowing? Because to me, that really does help ensure ethical conduct by corporations. But the Republican Party might dust off their Whistleblowing Improvement Act to change Dodd-Frank and the regulations significantly. It would provide that there would be no way that you could get an attorney to represent you on a contingency fee basis. So you got to pay for all those costs of attorney fees right up front. That if you're culpable because you were ordered by the CFO to maybe make adjusting entries that violated GAAP, you would have to go ahead and you couldn't get the bounty because you were culpable. But you're the ones with the evidence, and you were ordered to do so. And then finally, a key provision that Republicans would like to look at is that you could only whistleblow to your employer first, and not go direct, even if you're concerned that the employer is not going to take any action and there may be corrupt. So just some entering first comments. Thank you.
I'm encouraged with the level of increased transparency and the leakiness of systems today. And I think it's actually giving the grist to the mill of our ability to cope with ethical challenges in the future. And in that context, I'm convinced that one of the key elements is going to be this idea of effective self-regulatory systems in the context of targeted government regulation. And that's a point you'll hear from me a couple times today. I just believe that vigorous industry self-regulation in the context of targeted government regulation is one of the critical elements to a future grounded in integrity. And here's why. The hope for ethics has been around forever, but it's increasingly important in this very connected global world. Today we're going to talk about these three hot issues, banking, pharma, and AI. And I think we'll hear some ethical trends emerging. This won't be new to this audience. Stakeholders are challenging businesses in ways they never have before to grow trust, not only for their shareholders, but for their employees, customers, supply chains, communities, and on behalf of the wider natural world. Governments are striving to develop, implement, and manage a functioning legal and regulatory system. The debates are there. How far should it go? But there's no question it should exist. And businesses in this context are resisting what they term overregulation, that they argue muddles markets and curtails competitiveness. And I think when we look at the increasing rate of economic, political, and technological changes, these trends become even more important. The global society, economy, and ecosphere has few institutions operating within one geographic or political context. Money, ideas, people, and jobs are increasingly fluid in their movement. In this context, national decisions have both limitations and tremendous implications for the rest of the world. I'm really talking about fundamental decisions like war and peace, free trade or protectionism, growth or retrenchment, equity or efficiency. Really important stuff like that. We see the impacts of these decisions in mass migrations, growing inequality, and even the very sustainability of our climate. We're also living and working with complex systems that are well beyond the grasp of our common understanding. But I'm encouraged that the implications of those systems on us are becoming increasingly apparent and visible. As transparency increases, businesses are becoming exposed to wide knowledge and judgment of the outcome of their operations on people and the planet. The shields that they may have used in the past, things like legal privilege, protective philanthropy, or even, in some markets, outright bribes, now are just compounding the problems when exposed. You mentioned this. We now have products and services developed and delivered in ways beyond the capacity of government to keep up. This challenge is certainly evident in the developing world, where even functioning states can't provide basic services and oversight, not to mention the increasing failure of some states and emerging power and influence of all kinds of non-state actors. We think of that as the ISISes, but it's also things like Breitbart now going to Europe. These are non-state actors that are affecting the world in ways that we have not been prepared to cope with. And this challenge is also impacting developed economies, where the rate of change exceeds the capacity of governments to understand what's going on, let alone react. We've talked about that in some earlier sessions about the Ubers at Airbnb and how government regulators can't keep up. That's just the visible tip of the iceberg. You know, as Dan mentioned, most of my recent experience was in the alcohol industry, where I had the privilege to struggle with some of these issues. And I became increasingly convinced that many decisions previously attributed to government are now being made in the private sector. The Carnegie Endowment and Professor Virginia Hoffler titled this trend "The Public Role of the Private Sector." The public role of the private sector. So businesses today are being asked to react to issues like equity, fairness, sustainability, human rights, access to health care and education in ways that are new and for many unfamiliar. It's a far more complex world than one based solely on increasing shareholder returns. And yet I think these three ethical trends I mentioned earlier may provide a bit of a framework for going forward. Companies are beginning to engage with these diverse interests, seeking to create new products and services that build value for all their stakeholders, including but not limited to, certainly, shareholders. Governments are starting to recognize they can't keep up with the rate of change and are trying to figure out how to simplify regulation to impact the most critical questions of equity and fairness. And of course, that leaves a huge gap. Need for all kinds of internal systems of whether it's whistleblowers and ethical reporting systems, but also effective and transparent systems of self-regulation. So today you'll be hearing a little bit more from each of us about these trends and issues, and we look forward to your questions and your challenges.
So we're going to take some time now and go into a little bit more depth, if you want, the facts of the case of each of our three issues, and then we're going to hand the floor over to you for questions. And you know, in the audience, the senior, we also expect hope for some commentary and some of your insights and with regard to these topics. So I think without any further, shall we start with Wells Fargo, Cindy?
We shall. Thank you, Paul.
All right.
I actually had an inkling about something at Wells Fargo about 8 or 9 years ago. My younger daughter got her first job in a pizza restaurant, and she needed a place to put her earnings, and she walked across the street to a Wells Fargo branch in our Safeway and opened an account. And maybe about 4 years later, when she was a student here at DU, we saw that she was racking up all kinds of fees. And we looked into it, and we discovered that they had created a savings account for her with an automatic exchange of funds from checking to savings. And they would do this even when her checking account didn't have sufficient balance, which would lead to a insufficient fund fee, plus also they would take more than was necessary. And you know, we were going around in these things, and my husband and I looked at this and we just said, pull your money. Went down the street to Chase and put her money in Chase. And of course, me being a a professor at Daniels in the field that I'm in, I said, well, I can guess what happened. They're giving incentives for opening these accounts. This is an old story. This is an old story. Years ago, I was taught what gets measured gets done. So be careful what you measure, right? Be careful what you measure. The other side of that is what gets rewarded gets repeated. We all know how to train a dog to do things, right? We dangle a carrot in front of them, or we stand behind them with a stick. And in essence, a financial incentive program is the same sort of thing. We dangle a carrot or we stand behind with a stick. And either way, we can get the horse to move. The horse probably likes it a little better when there's a carrot, but either way, the behavior is the same. I've also was taught, if you look at a system that seems flawed or behavior that seems surprising, wasn't at all what you had wanted out of your employees, the first place to look is the reward system. Because what gets measured gets done. And so if somebody's doing something, there's a reason for why they're doing it. There's something that's compelling that behavior. Just call up one of your local service providers for internet or telephone or whatever, and try to get them to fix a problem that you have with your service. And you'll probably find them trying to sell you a new service. And what you'll discover is they're not rewarded for fixing your problem. They're rewarded for selling you more problems. And so this is the way that things have worked for a very long time. You know, the first use of a profit-sharing program that we know of in the United States was in the 1790s in Boston. The first use of incentive programs like we know them today came in the Industrial Revolution, Frederick W. Taylor. So these things have been around for a long time. Why? Because they work. The problem is they work too well. And other kind of motives get put into place. I think in general, though, a lot of these problems are because we measure the wrong thing. We measure the wrong thing. And why do we do that? Because it's too difficult to measure the right thing. Let's just use the university as an example. The university and I want my students to learn. How the heck are we going to measure that? Well, the university counts how many publications I have, and they look at my evaluations from students. Does that measure how much somebody has learned or how well I've taught? Should I be difficult? Should I be easy? What should I do? Just look in the paper about all of the debate about how to measure K through 12 learning and how to reward K through 12 teachers outside of seniority, but rather through student performance. That got us CSAPs. Has that worked? You know, this is an old story. We're seduced by easy measures. Quantity versus quality. It's easier to measure quantity, so we don't bother with quality. Time versus effort. You know, how hard I worked versus how much time I spent on this. We count things. Serving our customers versus making money. You know, these are conundrums we find. So it's hardly surprising, and this is not the last we're going to hear of this. This is not the last we're going to hear of this. Does anybody remember W.T. Grant's bankruptcy in the 70s? Does anybody remember Mickey Monas, former owner of the Iraqis, and his fun at Farmore? And you know, we could go on and on with this. To me, the noteworthy aspect here is the cover-up, as I said earlier. We see a lot of the usual factors in this situation. First of all, when the scandal gets publicized, what's the first thing the executives do? They blame the workers. They blame the workers. This is a very common pattern. It's the fundamental attribution error, as I mentioned earlier. They blame these workers who are so powerful, right? The bottom line workers are so powerful that it's their fault. The executives are surprised that this has occurred. Really? I didn't know this was happening. It reminded me of Enron and testifying before Congress. I didn't know anything about this. Oh, okay, that's good. There are growth projections. Wells Fargo wants to grow. And so in order to do this, they put in an incentive plan for fueling the growth with very poor, apparently very poor control systems. So that this is going on and nobody knows that it's happening. Somehow the word spread to the 5,600 or so employees that were terminated immediately. Somehow they knew. So either we have a toxic culture that encourages this behavior, puts employees in a tournament of sorts for the survival of the fittest, or we have a clueless culture where nobody knows what's really going on. Now, which one do we prefer? Toxic or clueless? I don't know which one is worse. Some people were doing this to get rewards, but many people were also doing this to avoid being fired. So we have the carrot, we have the stick. My younger daughter, who had the Wells Fargo account, has been working in a call center here locally, and she can tell you firsthand about the pressures that are put on them for metrics. And it's not metrics that will help them solve the customer's problem. It's metrics on getting off the call quickly. I mean, I remember studying this in the phone company. Remember the phone company and the dial phones and the operator who would answer? Do you know, AT&T had time limits on how much time the operator had to help you. Otherwise, they would be penalized. So this, you know, again, this is an old story. It's easier to measure the end than it is to measure the means. And what is it about that means end conundrum, Kevin, and ethical behavior? Another thing I think worth thinking about here is the reciprocity involved in it. The company screws me, so I'm going to screw them back, which is a very interesting point of view. And workers will report that they're just treating others as they are being treated. So there's no perfect reward system, and you know that's why I've been teaching classes for 40 years on this, because there is no perfect reward system. There's no reward system that rewards all employees fairly. When you come down to it, all you have is trust. That's really all you have is trust. All you have is your culture that supports trust. When you talk about self-regulation, the hair on my arms starts standing up, and how are we going to do this? You know, a culture like Whole Foods makes everything transparent, everything is talked about, the team makes the decisions, and has that been widely adopted by the Fortune 500? No, I would not say that that's a policy that is likely to catch steam. We think of John Mackey as kind of an odd bird, right? So we're not likely to do that. Rewards need to be aligned with our strategy. If we say that quality is what we're offering, we need to reward quality, even if it's difficult to measure. The most important things we do are the most difficult to measure. If customer service matters, how you treat the lowest level of employees matters, because who spends time with your customers? Your company is that low-level person, and if they're being treated in a harsh way, how are they going to treat your customers? Are they going to solve their problems, or are they going to sell them more problems? So this transparency thing, though, is a conundrum as well. The transparency, I fear, with my opening remarks, has made us just kind of, oh, well, here we go again. Oh, well, here it is again. Oh, yeah, this is, lie, cheat, and steal. That's what business does. Every day in our classrooms, we fight this idea and say business is the engine for good in the world. And yet we see so many examples where self-interested behavior has come to the forefront. So when we have our question and answer period in a bit, I'm very interested in hearing if any of you have had experiences with financial incentives that have worked well. And if you would share those systems with us so we can learn about some ideas for hope for the future, as Bart has suggested. Should the amounts be lower? Should the amounts be higher? What should we do about this? It's an area that's very difficult for research to be conducted in. You know why? Because this is the least transparent area within any company, is how we reward people, how we have decided which pay grade they get into, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why we think that pay inequity continues to occur, because there's so little transparency in how we actually decide how to reward people. And on that happy note, I'll pass it back to you.
Do you know, one question that I always wrestle with, and thank you very much, is sometimes when I'm in these ethics conversations, we all sound like Chicken Little. The sky is falling, there's climate change, it's artificial intelligence, it's fraud, and so forth. How on earth have we made so much progress in the last 500 years if the fundamental design of human beings is to screw things up as badly as we seem to be able to screw them up? So but thank you for that excellent tour of the guts of Wells Fargo, if you will. We're going to take another 15 minutes each, 15 minutes with a focus on pharmaceuticals and 15 minutes with a focus on AI, and then the floor will be yours. So over to you.
Could I just add a few comments?
Of course you
should.
Of course.
One of the things that caught my attention when the CEO of Wells Fargo was testifying, where in this universe would the CEO say in Congress, we didn't tell the board of directors for 1 year about this? How does that happen? And I find a little fault with the board, because in 2013, the LA Times did that story. Before I go into a board meeting, I Google Centura Health and say, where is there any controversy related to its services anywhere in any state? And all you had to do was Google Wells Fargo, and you'd get the LA Times story in 2013 instead of them learning it in 2015. The other issue that I have is just the mind-boggling aspects of the people that were charged maybe with whistleblowing, employees that really felt strongly. They were retaliated against, terminated instead of recognized and rewarded. And so, to me, that's unbelievable. And that one statement that we made at the beginning, news came out that each one of those offices where risk management auditors were going to actually look to see if all the documentation is there, those offices got 24 hours notice. And so then they looked at client signatures and scanning them into documents to go ahead and address that issue. Finally, as a CPA, where was KPMG in this for those 3 years? There was no disclosure as a contingent liability. And I'm wondering, should there be restatements? How did they audit for this kind of risk and noncompliance? It just really shakes me up, that this really occurred. And then finally, the CEO divested $60 million of his stock before the CFPB came out with the settlement of $185 million. and got a ruling in-house at Wells Fargo that it was not material, non-public information about that ruling coming out because it's just $2 million and we're a $30, $40 billion company. My goodness, what would a reasonable investor, knowing all the facts, would they view it as material? And as soon as the market digested it, did the Wells Fargo stock go down? In fact, Wells Fargo is now estimating that it may be billions with the federal and state investigations.
He sold $2 million in stock or $60 million?
60 million.
$6 million in stock.
60 million.
$60
Yep,
million in
yep,
stock.
yep. So anyway, just a lot of issues because the top 4 executives getting compensation, if those financial statements are restated due to misconduct, anybody's misconduct, then they have to disgorge. And so I just think there's all sorts of issues that we're going to learn through these investigations. This case is going to be classic.
Yeah.
I really do. Like Enron.
Interesting, very
Yeah.
interesting.
You know, I
What you
would
got
just-
for us on pharma? Should we go, or would you like to?
Yeah, just a
would
real
you
quick
like to add
comment.
on what-
Just
Wells
wanted to
Fargo?
relate this issue of management of ethics to just general management. A piece about this case that was kind of surprising to me was this. If you had a branch and then a group of branches that suddenly started to have performance that was outstanding by your own measures, you would think there'd be a curiosity why. And that the regional manager and even higher up, as those reports get rolled up and you say, wow, there's something really good happening there. Let's go find out why. They're producing a much higher level of account yields than most are. Where was the curiosity? And you're left with either the indifference or clueless or a much more
Toxic.
sinister alternative.
Yeah, and that was, of course, the story at W.T. Grant, the bankruptcy. They had been rewarding store managers for sales growth, and the store managers found that there was no audit process, so they just reported wild growth, and W.T. Grant didn't look into it, and they took on lots of debt to build new stores because of the great promising projections of growth, and wound up being taken over by Kmart, but that's another story. And that was Mickey Monis's story at Farmore as well. So, I mean, we don't seem to learn too well from these situations.
Ready to give us some
Sure.
some insights into the pharmaceutical crises of 2016?
Sure.
Good.
I'm focused mostly on the price gouging aspects and the ethics of it. When I teach intellectual property, I love starting with the Constitution. And you tell me if you think this is ethical. Article 1, Section 8, Congress authorized to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing the limited times to authors and inventors to the exclusive right to the respective writings and discoveries. It's not quite like a monopoly, but you you can go ahead and license what you invent and what you actually author as far as a writing. And the limited time for inventions is 20 years. And it really isn't a problem of price gouging, I think, because of the 20-year period. What I found in really researching, it's really after the pharmaceutical drug goes off patent. And then there are not the generic companies that actually go ahead and say we're going to compete. But the reason why I really like ethically what Congress set up, and the whole world has gone with this, is that John Rawls, when he focused on whether or not this was just, when he looked at rights and fairness, he said this is very fair and it makes sense, because are the least advantaged somehow advantaged by this rule in our Constitution? And I think it is. The least advantaged, they need the drug, but it will never be invented unless what? Unless you will incur the cost, employ the scientists to go ahead and discover that invention to make a drug that can help people. Now, maybe society can kick in during those 20 years. But after the 20 years, then that should be perhaps less expensive because you don't have an exclusive license. But companies have been clever about this, and you tell me if you think this is ethical. You have the patent about to be expired. What do? Oh, a competitor is considering a generic. You go to the competitor and say, we will share the profits of our drug with you if you don't enter the market. Does that sound like it violates the antitrust provisions? It does, and that has happened, okay? And so I'm just looking at all the situations where normally you see we would expect the price to go down, okay? When we look at price gouging, where have we seen price gouging, and is it similar? What happens when there's a hurricane hitting Florida? The price of water goes way up with Katrina, maybe $1,000 for a gallon. What does society do? Does it allow Adam Smith to basically say whatever the price will be, the free market system? It stops being a free market at that point. Should it just be sold in that emergency situation at the regular retail price? And so what we have here is the situation where we have drugs that are artificially high. Let me give you an example. Insulin, is that out of patent?
Yes.
From the 1920s. 4 companies are making insulin, but the price has skyrocketed. And they say, well, how's that possible? There's 4 companies, they should be all competing. The invisible hand should kick in. But it's not happening. And it's not antitrust because what do? One of the 4 increases the price, and the rest just mirror it. They have no collusion, no prior agreement under the Sherman Act. And so it's legal. But when you have that kind of tit-for-tat situation, and we're all going to, because this is very inelastic, that demand, we're just going to be able to just keep on increasing the pricing. We'll all ride together, keeping our respective market share. So when I look at price gouging, I see some of these instances where it happens. And the other place that I see price gouging is where companies' business model is to get out of the science of invention. Scientists are expensive, and these trials and everything else. Why don't we just look at patents that are expired? And so that's their whole business model. And you see it in several instances where we saw these people being investigated, CEOs, the $3 billion man that we saw with one company, and some of these names should be familiar with you. Of course, Martin Shkreli, remember him? And being so young, and with Daraprim that you mentioned, going from $13 per tablet after he bought that was his whole business model, and now it's $750. The Michael Pearson, this is at Valeant, their whole business model, and this was reported in the New York Times, Valeant is known for buying companies and laying off their employees, their scientists, to achieve savings while accumulating a lot of debt. It spends an amount equivalent only to 3% of sales on research and development. While regular corporations that are in the pharmaceutical industry for patents, they're spending 15 to 20% on their sales on research and development. So these companies are basically saying where there's barriers to entry into the marketplace for off-patent drugs, they'll find them and say, we can charge a great deal more. And I don't want to be political, but President Trump said, I'm going to negotiate, to bring those prices down. Whether we see that actually happening, this seems to be the business model over and over again. The other one that you all are aware of is probably Epipen. One competitor, then with the trials with the government, they're going to have to go back to the drawing board. So if you don't have a competitor dealing with their allergen reaction injector, $100 to 608. Heather Resch testified before Congress. Her new salary of $16 million is justified from a much, much lower figure. It doesn't take a lot of imagination and creativity to basically increase profits if you have that very inelastic demand, and you can charge whatever you want because of having patents that are no longer there, but there are no competitors. Or if there are competitors, you're basically wink, wink, and saying, why don't we just cooperate about our market share and just mirror our prices. So that's what really got my attention, price gouging, and we have a lot of other issues, but to me, all of this really is in conjunction with the whole national debate about what is our safety net? Are we going to have health savings accounts? Does that really deal with this problem of price gouging if basically you as the consumer have to go ahead and just save for any illnesses and trying to get drugs by yourself? It's going to be a fascinating debate dealing with Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid, and especially related to the pricing. So I just these are some of my analysis just related to it, but I hope it helps.
That's great. That's very, 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 very interesting. Indeed, it's interesting with pharmaceuticals, make the first pill costs you $5 billion or whatever it costs, and the next one costs next to nothing. It's
Yes.
like a Microsoft product in that respect. So you'd think when they go off patent and after 20 years, there'd be hundreds of market entrants, the price would collapse. That would be a classical economics would teach you.
Right.
And yet that doesn't seem to happen.
It doesn't seem to happen.
So what's
It's-
the mechanism, and perhaps let's hear some other views on this, but I mean,
Yeah.
what is the mechanism that prevents classical economics from, you could well argue that after investing $5 billion in developing a drug, they get 20 years to make as much money as they're able.
Mhm.
But
And in the meantime, these other companies can be doing the research. Isn't the patent available to see?
making copying a drug's easy peasy. That's the easy
Well,
part.
but to get ramped up to actually make it and have it still approved as a generic, that's where we run into.
Well, maybe that's the structural inefficiency in the market is getting the generic approved. But anyway, let's hear from.
Absolutely.
Shall we hear more about pharmaceuticals, or should we move on to artificial intelligence? What would
We
you?
will hear more about pharmaceuticals.
All right, awesome.
Because that younger daughter of mine, remember her? She uses an Epipen. So this one caught my interest as well. The free market. I love that you brought that up, Kevin, because the free market, the invisible hand is all thumbs. Charles Handy said how many years ago, what's a company for? And is it a piece of property that can be owned, or is it a community? And he uses the same example of during the hurricane, and he could have gouged price, and that's what his company wanted him to do, but instead he gave it away because the community needed it. So is that socialism and not capitalism? What is this? The thread I see between Wells Fargo and the price gouging is the least advantaged people in the situation having to bear the burden for the problem. And that, I don't think, is what John Rawls would have wished.
I'd just add maybe three quick points. One is increasingly pharmaceutical R&D isn't occurring by Big Pharma anymore. It's being
Right.
done by small startups who come up with a great idea and then Big Pharma buys it. So I'm not quite sure how that changes the dynamics of pricing, but I think it's an important trend. The second one is that the United States is probably the only developed country in the world that doesn't have vigorous negotiation of pharma prices. That's the reason why our prices are high, because this is the one market where prices can be raised and it can be sustained. You can't do that in the systems in Japan or in the UK or in France or any place else in the developed world. And the third point is intellectual property becomes a big part of this, because cheap generics are made all over the world and they're available. They're just done illegally using, violating copyright and patent laws. So
Canada.
And yeah, so it's an interesting place when you take what's going on in this country and put it in that broader context.
Very interesting. Very interesting, the prices we pay in this country, and if you believe some of the research on how pharmaceutical companies conduct drug trials and how many of the drugs that are in circulation that many of us maybe take are not as effective because they present the trials that give a very rosy picture. So you could say, in many respects, the American public is getting a very harsh deal indeed, both financially in terms of the benefits, and some of these things have side effects too. So these rosy pictures are costing human wellness, which I think is something we ought to be concerned about. Would you like to kiss off with a discussion of artificial intelligence, the Terminator, iRobot, and HAL, open the pod bay doors?
That's a perfect introduction, because I'd like to take you on a bit of a voyage. The history of mankind, or even before. Because as a species, we've been trying to do more with less labor for as long as we've been on the planet. In fact, even before we were humans, somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 million years ago, our ancestors that we share with other primates began to make and use crude tools. It took another 1 million years before our early ancestors first learned to control fire, and widespread use of fire for cooking is really relatively recent, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 years ago. It was 12,000 years ago that hunter-gatherers began to figure out they didn't have to hunt and gather anymore. They could cultivate food through agriculture. And then about 30,000 years later, in the 9th century, gunpowder and early machinery marked a whole new technological era. It was another 1,000 years in the late 18th and early 19th century that the Industrial Revolution accelerated our use of technology for the production of goods. If you think about it in terms of automated thinking, automated calculating, mechanical calculators became commercially viable in about the mid-1800s. Analog computers came about 100 years later. I remember in high school, in Toledo, Ohio, having a cable that went up to the University of Michigan and was using a timeshare computer. That was probably about 1968. Personal computers became commercially viable in the early to mid 1980s. The World Wide Web came into its glory in the following decades. Remember all the worries about Y2K? 17 years ago, right? Whoa. It was marked by widespread adoption of the smartphone, which seemed like a tremendous upgrade to our old PDAs. We joked that our phones now had more computing capacity than the computers that guided moonshots. Computer networks and new and cheaper storage and processing have exploded computer capacities, and we're now at the cusp of a new revolution based on quantum computing, getting beyond the restrictions of 1 and 0. So, we've been talking about technological change for a long time. Throughout this several million year history, each technological revolution was met with both excitement and dread. Each time, the social, economic, and environmental impacts were profound. Work changed, families changed, disruptions were all over the place, political structures were overthrown. Wars grew in scope and devastation. People migrated. There were winners and losers and lots of deaths. And yet, somehow, as a species, we adapted and we took the time to adjust, and we survived. Today's AI revolution isn't leaving us a lot of adjustment time. In 1984, Shoshana Zuboff, a Harvard Business School professor, wrote a book called In the Age of the Smart Machine, The Future of Work and Power. She described how this emerging computer technology could be used to empower, she called that informate, or to control, to demean and impoverish and control. And I think her book echoes the challenges faced in all of our prior technological revolutions, and it foreshadowed the artificial intelligence debate today. Will technology create opportunities we cannot even imagine and free us to pursue much more lofty ambitions? Or will it take away our jobs, our livelihood, our privacy, and our very dignity? We certainly have experienced a significant manufacturing job loss, and a lot of it's due to automation. A Ball State University study attributes 85% of U.S. manufacturing job losses to robotics and other productivity improvements. Only about 13% due to trade. The impacts are now moving to technical, analytical, and even managerial roles. According to a study done at Oxford University, over the next 10 to 20 years, 47% of all U.S. jobs are vulnerable to automation. Consider this observation by software developer Martin Ford, quoted in a December New Yorker review of his recent book. He said, "A computer doesn't need to replicate the entire spectrum of your intellectual capability in order to displace you from your job. It only needs to do the very specific things you're paid to do." James Manika, senior partner at McKinsey & Company, agrees that almost half the activities we pay people $16 trillion in wages to do in the global economy have the potential to be automated using currently demonstrated technology. This is current technology. He believes that most automatable activities involve data collection and manipulation and physical work in relatively predictable environments that include manufacturing, food service, transportation, warehousing, and retail. In the US, that's 51% of our employment activities and $2.7 trillion in wages. And he adds that even 25% of what CEOs do, like analyzing reports and data, could be replaced. He cautions that more jobs will change than will be automated away in the short to medium term. And several other experts observe that the eliminated jobs may be balanced by those created in enterprises yet to be determined. Consider, for example, that Google didn't exist 20 years ago, and its parent company, Alphabet, now has a market cap of over $500 billion. But these economic adjustments take time, right? And dislocation, disruption, and suffering are inevitable. As Elizabeth Kolbert notes in her New Yorker book review, picture the entire Industrial Revolution compressed into the lifespan of a beagle. New meaning to dog years. So returning to Shoshana Zuboff's key ethical question, will the AI revolution informate or denigrate? I want to try to break that down a little bit. At the most fundamental level, we encounter the warning from Stephen Hawking that AI will become an existential threat to our species. He told the BBC, "The development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. It would take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans, who are limited by slow biological evolution, couldn't compete and would be superseded." You know, other experts assure us that people can always gain control, at least in the foreseeable future. They hearken back to science fiction writer Isaac Asimov. I liked him in those high school days.
Me too.
He had those 3 laws of robotics. One, a robot may not injure a human being. Or, through an action, allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Of course, while in that domain, who here remembers the reference you gave earlier to HAL in 2001, Space Odyssey? But even before we confront that reality, we have fundamental questions about who will win and who will lose. How will robotics impact the distribution of political, economic, and social power across the globe? Will the current organization of nation-states still make sense? Or will transnational corporations control so much of the means and effects of production and employment with systems beyond government access and understanding that government's role will diminish? And the private sector will be playing this public sector role even more. And what about those whose work is no longer needed, be they executives, managers, production workers, service workers, ag workers, or anybody else? And particularly, what will happen to those who are not suitable for the new jobs that may emerge? We've dealt with dislocated work programs in the past. We're talking about something at a scale far greater. Do we need to fundamentally restructure access to income adopting, for example, guaranteed minimum income or negative income tax schemes to hold our societies intact? Or will we be content to let the unemployed fall through what will become overwhelmed safety nets? Next, we can look at the ethical decision-making built into AI systems themselves. We're all familiar with the self-driving car question, right? The car has a choice of slamming into the wall, killing the driver and anybody else in it, or running over a group of pedestrians. Now, networking among cars and other Internet of Things should make that a relatively rare occurrence, but it will still come up. So what should the car be programmed to do? Should the owner have a say in it? The military is actually already addressing this question with our drone attacks that currently require a human affirmative action to confirm a kill. But imagine a future battlefield. The AI system determines that the time for human action will result in a significant loss of friendly life. What should it do? Our forces are now testing swarms of smaller drones that use colony behavior modeled on ants and bees. As one officer explained, when you eliminate the need for human control, you can buy a whole lot more of these. So how much autonomy do we want to give to the swarm? You know, there's one final ethical question I'd like to bring up that's really more about opportunity than risk, because artificial intelligence also gives us the capacity to understand literally more than we can imagine. Companies are already using AI to analyze their supply chains, to eliminate human rights abuses, environmental risks, and reduce their carbon footprints. There's a lot of positive work that AI will make happen. The very modeling of our planet's atmosphere, oceans and surfaces, will give us knowledge that we may use to address the other existential threat of climate change. AI in the end will do what we tell it to do, I guess, unless Stephen Hawking's right. So what are the rules going forward? How do multinational organizations, governments, companies, and the rest of us have any say in all this? Last September, the New York Times reported that tech companies' main concern is having regulators jump in and create unworkable rules around their AI work. Peter Stone, one of the authors of a Stanford University report titled Artificial Intelligence in Life in 2030, remarked, "We're not saying there should be no regulation. We're just saying there's a right way and a wrong way." The Stanford report itself states that, I'm quoting here, attempts to regulate AI in general would be misguided. Since there's no clear definition of AI, it's not any one thing, and the risks and considerations are very different at all levels of government. David Kenny, general manager for IBM's Watson AI division, is quoted as saying, "There is a role for government, and we respect that. The challenge," he said, "is lots of times policies lag way beyond the technologies, way behind the technologies." So as Dan mentioned, 5 tech giants, including Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, IBM, and Microsoft, have come together and agreed that industry self-regulation, in the context of some scheme of appropriate government regulation, is the way forward. The Times reported they have formed a new industry group modeled on a similar human rights effort known as the Global Network Initiative, in which corporations and non-governmental organizations are focused on freedom of expression and privacy rights. But specifics of the effort, including even its name, are still being hashed out. This is really emerging. You know, as you might expect from my introductory remarks, and with a lot of skepticism and understanding that self-regulation has its own challenges, I'm still quite intrigued with this approach, particularly if the self-regulation process, standards, and the underlying values are fully transparent and open to broad input, debate, review, and constant modification. It's going to require computer scientists to interact with social sciences and philosophers. That's been proposed by Joe Ito, director of the MIT lab and a member of the New York Times board. I'm also encouraged by some of the work at MIT that is trying to ensure that AI and robotic systems have what they call society in the loop. That means humans will still need to be part of any system. This I am convinced of. While the workings of AI systems will be well beyond our common understanding, we'll know what the impact is on our lives. We'll feel it, we'll see it. Like generations of our ancestors, we will be on a transformational journey, this time at blinding speed. It's going to be quite a ride. And in these situations, we used to say, fasten your seatbelt. But I suppose now the robots do that for us. What do you think? Should we trust them?
Yes, very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have, before we hand it over to our audience, do we have anything to add to that, either one of you or both of you?
Well, I was struck by Google frustrated with its Translate product because it just wasn't getting past around 88% successfulness related to translating. And then they hired a lot of scientists in AI. And within a year, it's almost 100%. And so I'm wondering if they're going to apply that to the driverless car, and it's going to happen so fast, we have 500,000 drivers for Uber and cab drivers. And so my question is, what's going to happen to them? Could it be that fast? I have students that claim, because they're so savvy, they think it's going to be 8 to 10 years when we're just completely driverless, where NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Agency, says, it's going to be in 4 stages, and it's probably going to be 20 years. But maybe, in all of our lifetime, we'll deal with a driverless car, and we won't cause car wrecks by texting at the same time.
Gosh.
Already got.
I think that first of all, my younger daughter is not a robot. So I'm not going to bring her into this conversation. But the artificial intelligence thing is fascinating to me. I'm a psychologist, and I think whose intelligence are they going to decide is the important intelligence. I like a Jetsons kind of a view of the world when it comes to things like that. But I'm struck. The last word you said was trust, and here we go again. Those same studies of ant colonies have shown that civilizations that cooperate and collaborate last longer than those that are competitive. Mm-hmm. And so, it all comes back to social capital, community. What's right and wrong isn't so hard when we all have the same values. So diversity, similarity, all of these things, it's a fascinating world that maybe my daughter will study. I got her in there somewhere. Okay.
Yes, that old curse, may you live in interesting times.
Yes.
They are.
Yes,
they are. You had something to contribute already, please.
Mm-hmm.
He basically trains a computer like you would a brain. And to do that, you have to have huge sets of data. And so one of the ethical issues I see coming up will be the data collection and who has the data. And then they will be the ones controlling where the industry heads and all of that down the road, which I think we already have issues with data collection and being watched, but I can see that being a lot more extreme down the road.
Sure. And the rules by which they interpret the data too. So, there's still a human in the machine setting these rules. Did you have something for us just next door?
My comment was I believe AI is an amazing thing. The data is one thing, but also we saw that Facebook was tweaking their algorithm. So in other words, to come with outcomes that they wanted to control. So the AI is only as good as who controls the output, or in essence, potential data sets that they evaluate, or how they weight certain data. That becomes to an ethical standpoint of, if you're controlling what you want the outcome to be through data analytics, where's the ethical, moral around that for potential financial gain?
Years ago, I remember driving past a sign in front of a business, and it said, "What's the most dangerous part of a car?" And the answer is the nut behind the wheel.
I'm curious that there hasn't been a lot of mention about the millennials and on these three topics, and I'd like to get your feedback on it. I too have a daughter who is a millennial, and when I look at the issues that we just discussed today, when it comes to AI, that's not even a second thought for them. I mean, it's what they live with, that's what they do. When it comes to, you talked about the transparency around rewards and the compensation. They are very transparent. Everybody that's a millennial knows what everybody else is making in the company, and so they are very verbose about that. So maybe that will have an impact on the transparency issue. And when it comes to pharmaceuticals and the cost, especially when something around an Epipen or insulin, the millennials are very compassionate. I mean, they are looking at what is doing the right thing for the underserved and underprivileged, and just general people not being able to afford $700 for an Epipen that's life-saving. So I'd like to get your feedback when it comes to the millennials who will be driving this, or are driving it currently, and will continue to do so.
Good question. Are they a lot smarter than us? Or are they going to save us? That may be true. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that they're different. We go through our lives and we acquire things. My students, they don't want to own a car. They just would like to have a car show up on a variable cost basis and then ride it and let it drive. And it's amazing how open they are to technology. I mean, I saw in 1994 the first web page. Students showed that to me, and I said, this changes everything. But for them, all of this technology is there from birth. And so they come to expect that, it's going to help them, and they embrace it. Whereas, it's a little more difficult for me to imagine a completely driverless car. It's not hard for them to imagine.
Well, let's remember that you started off your trip down history lane with tool. It's a tool. But it's how you use the tool that matters, right? It won't matter what the tool is. It's how it's used that has an impact. If millennials are sharing their salary information with one another, and they believe in a post-truth world and alternative facts, how do we know that what they're sharing is reality? Mm-hmm. And so the transparency in salaries, I think, has to come from the company. It can't come from other people telling you what they're earning. The last thing I'll say is, this is very not PC. I do not put a lot of credence in generational theories because I heard my dad say the same thing, and he probably heard his dad say the same thing, and we all said it, and it's just we grow up in different times. We grow up in different times, and so kids are using technology at a very, very young age, and so it's just another tool for them. And they're the ones who are going to guide how we manage all of this. And I really hope deep down in my heart that this care for the community will continue to flourish. I don't always see it in people of that age.
We old people may not be doing too badly. I had a black and white television. It was my first television, so.
Well, yeah, and you think about where we went from in our own lives, from me sitting there on my, teletype computer terminal timeshare to now having my iPhone and feeling like I'm in Star Trek, computer tell me where to. And you think of that change and just think where that will be. I think we as a species are programmed for adaptation and change. It's just going to get a lot faster and a lot more revolutionary. I just can't even imagine what my 20-year-old daughter will be living, the world she'll be living in at my age. I just can't even, I don't have the imagination.
Are we ready to be the second most intelligent species on the planet?
Yeah.
Are we ready for that?
Are we ready to be not the biggest economy on the planet?
Are we ready to be not the biggest economy in the United States? We're
Yeah.
very close. Bob, please.
We have a microphone up there.
Bob's an accomplished public speaker. He can probably make himself heard anyway. Oh, actually, it won't be on the recording, though, so I think we want to capture you for posterity here. So if you hold that for a second.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel for a very rich, very robust conversation. I've been making some notes here. And I want to put in a plug for the concept of trust versus the concept of ethics. I've spent the last 5 years working with an organization who's worried about trust and wants to improve trust. And I heard Paul say, trust makes the world go around. I heard Cindy say, all you have is trust. Kevin talked about trust. Bart's last word talked about trust. So it's a theme, and I want to really jump on that right now. We really have to change the context in which we operate if we're going to make some progress on this corporate integrity thing. And I think, as Cindy said, we are measuring the wrong things because it's too difficult to measure the right thing. Didn't you say that, Doctor? And she's so right about that. And I'm going to submit from the work that I've done that measuring values and ethics, as much as I write about that or believe in it and speak about it, measuring those things is really hard. So I've been struggling trying to find what can we measure that will be easier, that will help us move the needle. And I've said we can't change human nature, but we can influence human behavior. And I think that comes back to measurements and rewards, as Cindy was saying. So she asked the question, what's your experience with financial incentives that work well? And she wanted to hear some of the audience. And from the work that I've done, I've seen organizations, Mayo Clinic, Zappos, Google, people like that, who are measuring not only financial metrics, which is the traditional stuff that I did when I was in the workforce, but they're measuring, do you operate in accordance with our values? Do you operate in accordance with our culture? And literally 50% of bonus systems in those organizations that I think are very progressive, I think Whole Foods is probably the same way, are measuring people, rewarding people, terminating people who either are operating with or against, the values and the culture of the organization. But I really think that it's hard to measure values, or people would say whose values and which culture. I think trust levels among stakeholders are easy to measure. You can ask your customers, do you trust us or not? You can ask your employees, you can ask your vendors, you can ask your shareholders. So if we're seeking some way to move the needle and to measure something a little easier, and I want to build off your words about trust, I'm going to put out the idea that starting to talk about, let's measure the stakeholder trust that they have in us, all our various stakeholders, might be a way to move the needle. And I wonder if you react to any of that comment. Measuring trust as opposed to the ethereal concept of are you ethical or are you values or things like that. That was my statement, and I invite the panel to comment.
I have a reaction to what you said, Bob, and it's that we want our employees, we want the members of our community to share values. But what happens when we all share the same values? Is that good or is that bad? What we also need is principled dissent. We need people who are willing to speak truth to power out of those values and question and challenge. And what happens to you when you're in a position of authority in an organization and people come to you and they say, I think this isn't the right way to do things? What happens to people like that? Any of you watch The Simpsons? What happens to people who come in and say the wrong thing to the boss in The Simpsons? The trap door opens and they go down into an unknown place. Speaking truth to power has been an issue for a long while back in your history of the world, right? Antigone. The theme of Antigone is don't kill the messenger, right? So, and it's inherent in whistleblowing. It's an inherent problem in whistleblowing. When somebody blows the whistle, what's the first thing we do? We say, okay, they got an axe to grind. How many of you think that the things that are posted on Glassdoor.com about your company are just people with sour grapes? That's the reaction of most people. Would you be surprised to know that for the Fortune 100, postings on Glassdoor.com are the best correlate of stock price?
It's interesting, very interesting. Very interesting.
So we blame the other and we support ourselves. And so yes, we want people adhering to values, but one of those values needs to be that we will listen to contentious points of view. We will listen to things that we need to hear about our values, because otherwise we have a cult. We don't have an effective company.
Thank you. Let's hear some more. I think you had your hand up first. Neil, would you, for Neil from level 3, and then can we come to you there afterwards? And I think you had something also, Joe? Is that right?
Sorry.
I got your name right? And Aaron. Good, excellent.
Thank you. So I think when I first became a compliance practitioner, the seminal case was Enron. But I think the replacement is going to be Wells Fargo, because I think
I agree.
so many executives did not see themselves or their companies as potential Enrons. But we should all see ourselves as potential Wells Fargos, because in and of itself, cross-selling and upselling is perfectly legitimate.
Sure.
It's a valid business tool for growth. It's the message that then follows that in terms of the how and not just the what that I think that in the compliance world we need to be concentrating on, because it goes to what you measure, it goes to what you reward, and it's not just on the sales organization. When I'm training in my organization, it's a great case study to use, because I use it in my operations team. When talking about the metrics that people are being held accountable for, yes, it's perfectly okay to hold your team accountable for achieving, moving the widget from the left side to the right side. But how you deliver that message as a leader and as a people manager is critical, because we can all be a Wells Fargo.
Very good, very good. And can we come down here and have a few more from our audience before we go back to our panel?
Great point.
Thank you. That's with a big sigh. On September 1st, I retired as Senior Vice President of Private Banking at Wells Fargo. Only a coincidence, and I say this with a sigh because of my awareness of the sadness of what we're talking about, and at my core, believing that Wells Fargo is a good company. I know John Stumpf personally, and he's a man of great integrity. So I would raise the question, John, or ask him the question, at what point, you're a man of integrity, did you know this was going in the wrong direction? To your question, do financial incentives work well? As a 30-year financial services professional, I will say comp drives behavior.
Sure it does.
And so again, it is with sadness. My departure, I think, maybe partly because big corporate, I was tired of that culture. I'm doing some consulting work now, but I do think that Wells has raised their hand and taken accountability and said, we screwed up. And again, I believe it's a great company, and it will reinvent, and it will course correct, and they will continue.
So you just left or just joined?
I left September 1st.
You just left as of September 1st?
September 1st, I was able to retire, and I'm going on to new things.
Okay.
But it's with great sadness
Can you
that
help
we
us
have
out?
this conversation.
I understand the harbingers of this would come back to 2004. So some of the employees who left said, this is going on since 2004. That seems a long runway to me. I spoke, and started off very much with these long runways. Could we have known? Should we have known?
Absolutely.
Who did know? What do you think? What's your speculation or knowledge about what might have been going on?
To your other point, is it a culture of toxicity? Was it a culture of cluelessness? I think a culture of fear. People feeling that they were going to lose their jobs because, again, it's all about the numbers. In the retail world where this was prevalent, and I think many have had the experience, just as your daughter did, it was about the widgets. It was about, again, driving that behavior. Were people aware of it? Absolutely. Even in private banking. I mean, I had said this to senior leadership many times. People fear losing their job if their sales quotas and if they're not reaching their sales numbers, even if they're a great technician.
And those are bad years. Never a good year to lose your job, but those are very bad years to lose your job back then. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, this is what, I'm going to take advantage of the fact you're here. It's wonderful. Thank you. So 5,000 people were hired as soon as the news broke. And assuming the mindset is that these 5,000 people autonomously had some kind of cabal or conspiracy to do this, it's an interesting, the fundamental attribute. Let's blame the people, let's blame the worker, rather than the incentives, management practices, messages, whatever else may have been systemically accountable. That strikes me as being someone who's never taken a class on OB or who's never read a textbook on management or something like that. How is that error? What's your speculation about that or knowledge of that?
Sadly,
is it a symbol?
is it a
symbol? Let's sacrifice some lambs, or
you have to remember those 5,000 people are all over the country.
Sure.
So there was no collaborative, right?
Sure.
And this is again where you look to the leadership, the top of the house, and say, were you aware of this? Because if you were, shame on you. If you weren't aware of it,
shame on you.
Shame on you. So it was prevalent throughout the company. And again, it was impacting those retail bankers.
Very good.
It's to me, it feels, it's a very sad era.
I won't pick on you anymore.
That's okay. I raised my hand.
But thanks. What do we think?
Well, the 5,000 employees, I'm really empathetic because they're not bad apples.
Absolutely.
How do you get 5,000 human beings to commit fraud against other people?
Because it drove bad behavior. They were afraid of losing their jobs if they didn't get the widget, if they didn't open the next account. And the fear of job loss is what drove the behavior.
But why couldn't that be envisioned by the executives of Wells Fargo to really make sure that there was no fraud?
Shame on them.
When people are leaving in exit interviews, do you think they're going to say, I'm leaving because there's fraud here? They don't ever say what they really think when they're leaving because they're leaving and they're going on to something else. So, yes, there's a pattern there. It's fear, I think, is a good way of looking at it, but from a psychological viewpoint, this is the big issue, and Bob really mentioned this a few minutes ago, is we know what's right and wrong. We know what we would do if we were in that situation. We get in that situation, what happens? We don't. Why not? Because we have lots of explanations, right? They made me do it. The little people don't understand the pressure I'm under. We come up with all kinds of excuses. That's the fundamental attribution error. And this was shown in one of the most interesting research studies I've ever seen, where they looked at the shareholder letter in the 10Ks. And when a company had done really well in the previous year, the shareholder letter said, boy, did we make good decisions. When the company had done much more poorly the previous year, did we make bad decisions?
The markets were tough.
No, the
Headwinds.
markets
Very
were tough.
Very tough that year.
Our competitors did something we didn't know. Right in the 10K letters, you can see this. So the human mind so far justifies things so quickly, it's very hard to tell what has just happened.
I'm a little
And why?
intrigued with this kind of the word fear that came up here and the word trust that came up here. Because those seem to me like very different worlds, right? A world where you really don't feel trusting if you're feeling fear.
That's right.
And if
It's
you're feeling
impossible.
fear, if you're feeling trusting, fear is not part of the equation. You can be authentic. You can bring your whole self to work. You can bring your whole self to your job.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, this sense of broader stakeholder engagement, starting to think about these broader questions of equity and fairness and these, which businesses have not been trained to do generally.
Because
right?
they're
It's
owned
been
by
trained to be,
shareholders.
shareholders
Yeah.
own the firm, we must.
That's right.
Right, that dynamic, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that these kinds of scandals are going to affect culture over time. That the ability to continue to do that because of transparency will diminish, and companies who are acting in those ways will be caught, and their shareholders will be the losers in the end.
Well, we catch companies every year. I mean, as part of my preparation for this, I did a bunch of research on pharmaceutical settlements over the year. Starts with GlaxoSmithKline at the top, the largest, $3 billion. There's one every year. There's every year a pharmaceutical company gets caught with their hand in the cookie jar, bribing, manipulating results, breaking the law. They get a fine, and we move on to the next pharmaceutical company the next year. And if you look on Wikipedia, pharmaceutical company financial settlements, you'll see that there's one every year. And I'm a banker too, historically, by profession. And I became a banker in 1981. And since then, there's been a small scandal every year, and there's a big scandal punctuated. It's LATAM, it's Long-Term Credit Bank, it's Kidder Peabody in the United States, it's LIBOR. More or less every 3 or 4 years there's something. And then we all run around like Chicken Little, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened, and I've never seen anything like this before. And then there was 2007, 2008, which is the worst it's been since 1929. In what senses are we averse to learning? Is there a big message that we're not getting, that's just somehow not getting through? Or are the banking scandals today, Wells Fargo, for example, any different than what I saw in the beginning of my career in 1982, 1983, 1984? I don't really think they are. And there may be, this is a question, and I'd love to hear your views. Is there some big message that we're missing, some fundamental thing that will stop our lives being punctuated every year in every industry with another, oh my God, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. How could we not have seen this coming? So is it part of, you could say, and Bob's going to view, now we haven't heard from you, so let me just, I know I've got 7, I must have asked a good question, so everyone's hand's gone up. And Aaron, I know you've been waiting for a while too, so let me hear from you, because you want to jump in right here, and then Aaron, if we may, and then perhaps over to some of our usual suspects over there. Can we please?
Hi. Just to kind of tack on what you said, I was kind of going there before you said it. So I've been in the financial industry for 30 years now. And what fascinated me partly about the Wells Fargo is in 2004, we had market timing scandals. It wasn't illegal, but they found a way to circumvent what happened in that industry and across the brokerage firms. And they figured out a way to levy fines, to charge the industry. Then we move on to 2008, and again, we had another scandals with the banks. We had Goldman, we had Barclays. They all fell out of that, and again, it wasn't so illegal. Did anyone with Goldman go to jail? No. So now we're in the Wells Fargo. And what
they get a job in the cabinet, actually. Forgive me, had to. Anyway, carry on, please.
So now with Wells Fargo, it's sales. And this is a totally different. You go from market timing of moving people's money around too fast, and then you have what happened with CMOs, and now we're in sales part. So to me, as compliance and ethical individuals, we need to figure out what's the next. if we're going to help this to move past it, we need to be ahead of the game. And even in the IE industry, it was before, several years ago, it was cloning. I mean, I was thinking about the cloning and the ethical situations that revolved around cloning. And so we went from cloning now to IA. So we just have to be clever. To your point, what are we missing? What do we need to think about within our multiple industries in order to help all of us get past, or our enterprises to lower that regulation? Because I think we're in an environment where all we want to do is regulate this. We can't do that. We cannot regulate everything.
Very good. Can I hear from my friend Erin's been raising her hand, and I've been ignoring her. That's horrible. So can we hear from Erin, and then perhaps
This
from...
lady had the microphone.
Have we got another hand there? Okay, excellent, good.
So, circuitously responding to your question, I'm going to go back to what Dr. Fukami said about better financial incentives, and my experience as a consultant and in corporate world, and listening to executives that I coach. The examples that I've heard that seem to work the best are ones that I would call polarity-based incentives that incent, and going back to compensation incents behavior, is incentives that have both a piece that says this is the end result we want, something sold, financial, some quantity of something done, with boundaries or parameters put around them that said you only get this bonus or this compensation if you also meet the safety standard, or meet the regulatory standard, or meet the some other safety, human goodness values, whatever it is. That, in my experience, those are the ones that seem to work the best. My sense is also that means you have to have senior leadership that actually wants an ethical environment, but those are the ones that seem to have the best sense of this is not a one modal behavior that we want. We want behaviors within these parameters, and it reinforces the message that it's a both-and scenario.
Excellent. And while Lamarck's traveling, so someone said human greed. We never do anything about human greed. I'm just going to throw this out there. I expect fully to get booed off the stage. There was a guy called Karl Marx who said it was the system that made people greedy.
That's right.
And compete with one another.
That's right.
Rather than we naturally competitive, and so therefore we need to design a system that, in a sense, handles human competitiveness. And it's quite interesting. So he believed that humans were born to work, they were born to collaborate, and then our natural state of being was to work together to create value for ourselves. That was part of what distinguished us, is our ability to work together as human beings. And he said, then we've created these other systems, feudalism, capitalism, and those systems set us against one another, and the manifestations we say of that are greed. Now, I'm not nearly smart enough to make that as a claim, but he's a very smart fellow. And that was his hypothesis, is that we're greedy because of the system we live in, and the fear of losing one's job that living in this system does. And so our behaviors are natural human adaptations to those systems, rather than think. So anyway, no one's booed yet, so I can change the...
I think also what we need to do is look at things at kind of the micro level too, or the process management level, where you have a process that delivers a certain output. Services are consistently more difficult to measure than maybe manufacturing a widget. But if your process management incorporates your inputs, one of those inputs being your integrity standards or your values standards and your mission statement and stuff, that you create a process that not only delivers the output, but it's an ethical output and a process that measures itself. And so when the process measures itself, then you can see what are the things that can be improved. And then on the financial incentive or compensation, that employees are compensated for improving the quality metric or the quantity metric, and even if it eliminates their job, they're not at risk of losing their job It's the people who aren't looking for efficiencies, et cetera, that maybe you might want to give them the boot, but not the people who are truly interested in providing a cost-effective solution.
You've been waiting again. My friend Dan is signaling we were almost out of time. Do we have time for one more remark from the audience and then maybe a minute each from the panelists to summarize or thereabouts?
If you can keep it to those.
If we can keep it, please. I know you've been waiting for a little while. And then we'll come back and we'll make some summary comments, if you will.
Well, I once had a client who really put it right. Long-term greed is really good because you take care of your customers, you take care of your people, you take care of everything. Short-term greed is bad.
Very good.
So that's one thing. The second problem, though, is when we take a look at what's happening and all the change in our society going on in business, the job cycles are so much shorter. And so then the question is, how do you reconcile those two things? Because what's interesting is if you go back, you know, when I was in graduate school, which was in the late 60s, all the big brokerage houses were partnerships. And the way it worked was they were general partnerships, so that if anything went wrong, everybody got it. And you kind of got a reasonable salary, and then you ended up getting your money back over a 10 or 15-year period. So everybody was looking over everybody's shoulders, and they were all worried about how the company's going to do after, how the firm was going to do later. And then we had, you know, all the financial services companies go public, et cetera. And this gets back to what the short-term thing is. So, you know, Cindy, you know, you expressed that so many of these things so well. The question is, do you have any thoughts about how you can reconcile the two in a manageable basis in our society?
It's really great. And there are two different structures in our brain. There's an older structure, the limbic system, which responds to emotional stimuli. It's more primal, if you will. And then there's this center, this thing that is a more recent invention. And the two can frequently be at war, and they have different time horizons. So frequently the long term is delaying gratification, and the short term saying, feed me, Seymour, feed me now. And so we have that, in a sense, war between our higher faculties and our higher intentions as human beings, and more primal urges. So anyway, I think that's the last thing. Is anyone, I think particularly, you might have something to do?
Do you want me to answer you? Yeah, so I taught my first business class probably 40 years ago, and I'm quite sure that I made the point, why do we work on the short run instead of the long run? Why do we do that? So this is another one of those, this is an old story. How do we get people thinking about the long run instead of the short run? What was the first sentence I said earlier? Can anybody answer his question? What gets measured gets done, what gets rewarded gets repeated. We say we pay lip service to the long run, and we reward the short run. That's why it's so noteworthy to me when I see a study that links these things to publicly held companies, because they should have the harshest problem with the short run, because they have the need to report quarterly earnings. So it is an issue, but I'll segue into my closing remarks at the same time, which is that, you know, this is just a basic dilemma in civilized world. Self-interest versus collective interest. Self-interest versus collective interest. And all we'd have to do is have Kevin run a prisoner's dilemma for us, and we'd illustrate it ourselves. I'm a sucker. I'm a sucker because I stayed to help, right? Mm-hmm. And you start feeling like a sucker in these reward systems, and you're going to want to reciprocate those feelings to others, and this is how it starts to spread.
That's a great.
If Wells Fargo had focused on the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations, it says right in there, if you have a reward or punishment structure, that causes unethical or illegal behavior, you're not going to get a break from the enforcer. That's not going to be a factor in mitigation because you don't have an effective ethics compliance program. And I think Wells Fargo, they missed the boat. Why didn't they focus on the customer experience and measuring that instead, and maybe selling the products, but they were so focused on selling the products they actually made up the products.
It's the antithesis.
You know, someone mentioned earlier the price gouging after Katrina on water. And I remember contrasting that to a story that was told after the tsunami and the disaster in Japan of this lady who ran a shop who had kerosene. She had a lot of kerosene. And that became essential for survival. Her reaction was, this is my community. This community has supported me. I've made a lot of money from this community. I'll make a lot of money in the future. I'm giving the kerosene away. She rationed it so that nobody could be greedy and made it work. What is it about that culture and her decision making within her business that was different from the business that was selling water at outrageous prices? And I think it does have to do with this time frame of how you see yourself fitting into the long run. And I just close by saying on the long-term, short-term thing, I think you've got to figure out a way to align the interest of shareholders with the other stakeholders by rewarding patient capital, by having longer-term incentives for the return on money. And so the short-term money is not as rewarding as it is today.
We're going to end there. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dan. Well done.
It's so good to close on an uplifting story of the lady with kerosene. She will be my idol until we do this the next time. Anyway, I want to thank you all. Paul, thank you for managing this thing the way you did, and got great substance out of panel and the audience. And Kevin, thank you for your being so well prepared and the great insights. And Cindy and your younger daughter.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for your insights, and Bart. You know, it's been a long time since I've had a history from a couple million years, and all done in like 2.5 minutes. So thank you very, very much. It was a wonderful panel. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
And thank you all for joining us this morning.